Welcome to episode 16 of the SJX Podcast. I'm Brandon Moore, and today SJX and I are going to round up some watch-related events going on around the world. We're going to introduce a new segment where we're going to disagree about a couple of watches and pit them head-to-head. And then we're going to wrap up with a discussion of the latest collaboration between Piaget and the Andy Warhol Foundation, a really nice addition to the lineup with a Collage marquetry dial. So, SJX, there's a few of these events coming out that are going to be in Singapore. There's a Vacheron event and a Rolex event. What can you tell us about how folks can attend these?
Well, both are open to the public, but you can register online to attend. The Vacheron event is very short. It's 2 days, and it's an anniversary exhibition. It's basically about the brand's history, shows some of the watches, and I think most interesting is that the exhibition has a space dedicated to the Barclay pocket watch, which is still the most complicated watch ever made in history. The watch itself is not there because I'm assuming it's in the owner's home in the United States, but the exhibition does have a lot of material, details, diagrams, pictures of the watch that I think are worth looking at if you want to understand how really complicated mechanical watchmaking is done. And then there is also the Rolex event, which is being staged by its local retailer, Cortina Watch. This is a 2-week event dedicated to GMT Master. I think this is the third stop of this event after Geneva and Hong Kong. And it's a comprehensive look at the GMT Master. So it starts with the history. It was a watch for Pan Am pilots as a GMT Master 1, and then the evolution into GMT Master 2. And I think probably the most interesting bit will be the modern day evolution of the GMT Master, where it's not just about the watch being a travel watch, but also the materials like Rolex's innovation in ceramics, the construction of the bracelet, the advances in the movement. The latter section, the modern aspect of the watch, I think is really what encapsulates what makes Rolex Rolex, the industrial, the engineering, and the quality achievements of the brand as a volume manufacturer at a very, very high level. I think you can see a lot of that in the exhibition. And you also attended, I guess you saw the counterpart of the VC exhibition in Paris.
Yes, so the Quest of Time clock was unveiled September 17th at an event at the Louvre where it still is. It is going to reside there until November 12th, and you can go see it with a standard admission Louvre ticket. Definitely book ahead because the lines are insane even when you do book ahead, but they've positioned this exhibition. It's in the Sully wing, and Vacheron has even staffed the exhibit with a couple of watchmakers, and they're kind of rotating through because it's going to be there for several weeks and until the 12th of November. But they're going to be there to answer questions about it and the rest of the exhibition as well, which is comprised of 9 other clocks that are from the Louvre's own permanent collection, a range of really spectacular objects going all the way back to, a fragment of an ancient water clock that's over 2,000 years old, all the way up to 2025 introduction of the Quest of Time. But it's a really interesting exhibit to see because it reinforces a few things. One, it reinforces the connection between artistic craft and watchmaking. And it shows that this is not just some post-quartz crisis fad that we're currently in. It shows that it is something that has been a part of watchmaking longer than the balance spring and longer than the verge escapement. Even the water clock was decorated inside and out with iconography representing their belief systems and what they found beautiful. Separate from that, there is also a few rooms away, Fred, the watchmaker, pointed me the way. There's a number of other watches and clocks in the Louvre's collection, and one of them really caught my eye because, there's sapphire crystal panels all the way around the clock showing the movement, and the barrel inside the movement holding the mainspring was relief engraved all the way around. And it really just shows that people have always wanted to see what's going on inside a watch, and watchmakers have always wanted to make the inside of the movement beautiful and a work of art in and of itself. And I think that those are a couple of themes that some people kind of today write off as frivolous or, just a sign of, the ostentation of our time. But it's really interesting just to kind of go look at how that has evolved over 2,000 years, and you can do that at the Louvre until November 12th.
And you actually made an interesting point. Today, everyone complains watches are too expensive and inaccessible. I complain many watches are too expensive. But this exhibition actually shows that for most of human history, time was only accessible by either very rich or very powerful people. Most of these clocks were owned by royalty, nobility, and even in closer to modern times, watches and clocks were really only owned by very wealthy people. It's only with recent industrial production that everybody has the time. Historically, actually, nobody had the time except the people in charge.
That's exactly right. And you can tell that, so many of these objects were meant to be status symbols first and foremost. The timekeeping, there's a French, basically the first or one of the oldest known French-made pocket watches. It's a small sphere with one hand, probably is egregiously bad as a timekeeper, probably, no more than, probably varies 2 or 3 hours a day at least, but it's richly engraved, beautifully made. The maker obviously took immense pride in putting it together. It was owned by, certainly, a wealthy person or someone connected to royalty. And, that theme continues on. Even Cardinal Richelieu's carriage clock is in the collection. Cardinal Richelieu, one of the most important political figures of his age. In fact, one of the 3 wings of the Louvre is named after him, the Richelieu wing. And then there's a small table clock for the Farnese family in Italy, and on the back are these motifs related to justice that are there to basically convince anyone looking at it that this family's position in society is justified and righteous. And that was really the theme, the astronomical clock, the pendulum clock of the creation of the world, which is actually one of the flagship clocks in the Louvre's collection. It stands right next to the Quest of Time, and in fact was restored in 2017 with funds from a grant made by Vacheron. That the entire idea of that clock is to impress upon anyone looking at it that the world is orderly and that the monarch's position is correctly at the top. Yeah. That's the whole idea of that object, is to completely blow away anyone who's looking at it and who might question whether this person really is deserving of their stature.
I think what would be interesting is if 50 or 100 years from now, a Quest of Time clock is in a museum somewhere, whether the museum would describe who the owner was, whether he was a head of state or something. Because as you know, Vacheron will not sell the Quest of Time that is on show in the Louvre, but they probably will make one for you if you can afford it and you order one. So I'm curious if anyone has ordered one and where the clock will end up when it's eventually produced and sold.
Well, I mean, you can certainly imagine that there are that watches like the Berkeley Grand Complication or the 57-260 that preceded it, both commissioned by Mr. Berkeley here in the United States, as you mentioned. You can certainly imagine that those are certainly museum grade pieces that we will look at, that subsequent generations, I hope will have the opportunity to look at those with awe.
And on the topic of art, has also made a debut in Piaget's latest watch, the Andy Warhol Collage.
Yeah, these are cool. Piaget was really an active participant in the New York art scene in the 1970s and has long had this relationship with the Warhol Foundation, basically the Warhol estate. And so it is officially licensed with his estate, which I think is interesting, and it kind of solidifies that connection. These pieces are artistic in that they are, made to a high standard. They are kind of period correct to the 1970s. They wear very well. I like having them on the wrist. The way the case is stepped up toward the center gives it a great weight balance on the wrist, especially in a precious metal It's wider at the base than it is at the top, so it sits really well on the wrist. And there's a lot of different dial options. This one combines a few strengths of Piaget, the craftsmanship when it comes to stone dials, as well as their marquetry expertise. So this kind of combines those two aspects. What are your thoughts on it?
I agree with you. I like the Andy Warhol as a product. It's ironic, actually. You probably know this watch was actually launched like 11 years ago. Piaget launched it as the black tie watch 11 years ago. And when it was launched 11 years ago, I don't think anybody really paid attention to it. But Piaget stuck with it and kept it around. And now they've renamed it the Andy Warhol, and it's become a lot more famous. And I think also 11 years ago, it wasn't really in tune with the taste of the times. Now it sort of fits into what people want today: foam watches, dress watches, smaller watches. So the Andy Warhol I think now it's become commercially successful. And the latest version, as you say, sort of plays to Piaget's strengths. It's a dress watch. It has a stone marquetry dial. I think the only downside for me is the movement. Now it uses a Piaget automatic movement, whereas the earlier versions used an ultra-thin hand-winding movement that you also found in the Altiplano. My guess is the current success of the Andy Warhol meant that Piaget was selling a lot more of these, which is why it moved to the automatic movement that I assumed it can produce in larger quantities compared to the manual wind movement before.
Yeah, and it's you mentioned that it's more in line with today's taste than it was at launch, and it does seem like we are in an era where there's a lot of 70s designs that are still enjoying great popularity, whether it's the Royal Oak, whether it's the Nautilus, other things that kind of have this square cushion shape. It definitely feels like it's kind of hitting its stride. I think it was probably only 2 or 3 years ago that I tried one of these on for the first time, and the case finishing is nice because each of those little steps on the bezel has a polished rim, and it kind of reminds me of kind of the unobtainium Patek Tre Scalini 3-step perpetual calendar that was sort of the prototype for the 3448. So it kind of has a little bit of that essence going on, which is always a watch that has kind of haunted my dreams a little bit. I'm not so into vintage, but that's certainly an exception I'd make. But this kind of gives you that same type of look and feel in a modern watch that you can actually go try and put your hands on and buy if you like it.
Yeah. And speaking of modern watches, I think this brings us to the this or that segment, right?
Yeah. So Ulysse Nardin just came out with the latest version of the Freak S with Flinke enamel dial. And so we thought this would be an interesting experiment. I really like some of these newer Ulysse Nardin products. SJX, I know you're often a proponent of kind of the earlier history of the Freak. And so I thought it would be fun for us to kind of debate kind of old versus new. The original Freak from 2000 was a groundbreaking watch when it came out in so many ways: design, materials, engineering. I'd love to hear, maybe a quick overview on your thoughts of that. And then I'll kind of give a counterpoint on why I think the new Freak S in enamel is a worthy peer.
For me, I think the original Freak, as you said, was really interesting when it was launched. It was radical. It was different. It was really, really special. Looking back, it's difficult to understand how special it was. I mean, imagine when the Freak was launched a year after the datograph, right? The Lange datograph. And when the datograph was launched, it was considered also radical landmark watch. A few years before the Lange one was launched, equally radical and landmark. Vacheron also launched the Resonance at the time. Unbelievable, again, at the time. So I think in the context of that era, it was very special. And I think this actually brings me to a broader point in that I think for certain collectors, for myself at least, the appeal of the watch often is more than the product itself, but also the time it was in, the era it is rooted in. And in a sense, it's nostalgia, right? Because I remember what the watch was when it was launched, what it meant, who the people were. So for me, it is interesting. And I think this is something that Well, this is a reason why there are some watches that might be interesting, but are not in demand or not even desirable today. It's because people do not have the same sense of nostalgia. They do not remember the history that someone like me does, which is a shame because these are interesting watches. But ironically, I think on a tangible, intrinsic basis, the original Freak is much less accomplished, it's much less sophisticated and refined than the subsequent versions. I mean, purely as a matter of practicality, it is just difficult to use. Winding is a pain because you have to wind it by the case back, that you don't really have superb grip. I mean, the Freak, they never created any sort of winding mechanism for it, so you sort of had to kind of press the back and wind it. Setting is also a pain because you have to turn the bezel, which is polished. It doesn't have that much grip either. And depending on the state of the Freak, sometimes you lose your time setting because you knock into something, the bezel turns on its own, which is why they introduced a bezel locking mechanism in subsequent Freaks, which is also kind of a silly idea because it's kind of ugly and it's not really a sophisticated mechanism. It's this little tab that locks the bezel. So, all of these together, it sort of shows that the Freak, in a way, was a product that is quite ahead of its time. It has so many interesting ideas inside, but they could not really be executed in a practical and usable, intuitive way.
Yeah, I feel like you're kind of making my arguments for me. The newer models solve a lot of those issues. But just to your point real quick, I think the nostalgia factor cannot be and should not be underappreciated. I think that explains a great deal of the buyer motivation that we see today. I often feel it within myself when I'm looking at certain watches that, remind me of a certain time, or even if I didn't know of them at the time, I think back to, this would have been released when I was a kid before I ever knew anything about these watches. I think back to like what I was doing in 1994 and, to think about that the Lunga 1 was being released at that time, right? Like that does, create a connection for me to some extent. But to your point, there were a lot of practical shortcomings of those original models, not to mention the fact that they had to revise the escapement shortly after it was introduced. They eventually got the double wheel silicon escapement to work with a mechanism that's actually quite a bit like the Rolex Dynapulse in kind of fundamentally. The newer models, the Freak S is really the one that got me intrigued with this design. I always had trouble with the design of the Freak, frankly. Just a little bit too outrageous for me, but taking it to the level of putting almost a spaceship on the dial and then putting the double inclined balances linked by a differential, and then connecting it to the fixed ring around the dial from kind of the opposite end where it is on the other Freaks. Normally, it's sort of at the tip of the minute hand. Here, it's kind of on the balance end of the minute hand or the central carousel that goes around once per hour. But for me, it's really about the intellectual coherence of the whole package. The Freak S, the first model that came out in 2022, the Freak S Nomad, the Crystallium, and now the Freak S Enamel, they all exhibit the same level of intellectual coherence, from the super efficient grinder winding system that solves a lot of those problems with winding the watch. Instead of being a long power reserve manual, it's now kind of a medium power reserve automatic. You still have to manually wind it by turning the crown in the same way. It does have a little bit, a few notches that make that a little bit easier. But, the idea is that you don't have to do that because it's going to stay wound. And then to your point about setting, it's, an absolute breeze to set now. You do have to kind of flip up that little, I call it the Freak flag, but between the lugs at 6 o'clock. But from there, it's an absolute breeze to interact with and set. And I think the idea of mounting the double incline balances linked by a differential on a rotating platform really just sort of takes that concept to a higher level of just cool gadgetry. And so it's really been these more recent models within the Freak collection, specifically the Freak S, that have kind of drawn me into the story of this watch and its history, which is linked in a pretty concrete way with the use of silicon. So you have the not only silicon hairspring, not only silicon escape wheel, but also silicon balance wheel. A few years ago, the company that Ulysse Nardin owns or part owns, Sigatech, developed processes to make ever larger components in silicon to the necessary degree of precision. And so now they're even producing the balance wheels themselves in full, and then they have these weights that are set into them to give them enough inertia to be functional as balance wheels. And so for me, it's the modern ones are a pretty big step up. But I certainly see your point, nostalgia, and it certainly isn't as groundbreaking now as it was then, being the first watch with to use silicon components, this really novel double wheel escapement, and certainly a entire format that was altogether new at the time.
And I guess it's worth pointing out that the newer ones, for what they are reasonably priced by today's standards. They are still expensive watches, but by today's standards, which are very, very high, they are actually, I think, reasonably priced for what you get.
Yeah, I agree. Normally if you have anything with a differential and two balance wheels is going to be six figures. And those aren't mounted on a carousel.
Yeah, exactly.
In a watch that is part of a lineage that is always going to be a significant part of contemporary watchmaking history.
Exactly. So I think that wraps up this episode. And if you listeners have any ideas for head-to-head comparison, this or that comparison for future episodes, drop us a line. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening.